I gave you the pressure. I just said, put your hand behind your back. Put your hand behind your back. Put your hand behind your back. No, that's not gonna happen. Bro, put your hand behind the cuff. I said, put your hand behind your back. Put your hand behind your back.
The incident does not begin with calm or clarity. It begins with noise, urgency, and fractured commands layered over a volatile environment. Officers move toward a disturbance already in progress, their attention split between crowd control and individual identification. In these first moments, the atmosphere dictates the response more than any verified understanding of who is involved, what precipitated the conflict, or what legal thresholds have been met. This is the first structural weakness in the encounter. Authority is deployed before certainty is established. The opening scene unfolds in a public venue where physical movement, raised voices, and overlapping bodies obscure individual actions. Officers arrive responding to a report of a fight in progress. That framing matters. A fight call primes enforcement behavior toward interruption and dominance rather than investigation. From the moment officers step into the scene, the objective is not to determine facts, but to regain immediate control. Commands are broad, shouted, and non-specific. Everyone present becomes a potential subject. This approach compresses decision-making time and increases the likelihood that lawful behavior will be misinterpreted as defiance. In these seconds, we see the first shift in power dynamics. Authority is asserted collectively, not surgically. Officers move forward issuing commands to separate, disperse, and comply. The language is urgent and escalating, but it lacks individualized direction. When commands are not clearly directed to a specific person, compliance becomes ambiguous. That ambiguity later becomes consequential. As the crowd reacts, one individual becomes the focal point. Not because of a confirmed act, but because proximity and movement place him within the enforcement spotlight. The decision to isolate him occurs rapidly, without visible articulation of probable cause. This is the second structural flaw: selection without explanation. Once a person is selected, every subsequent action is interpreted through a lens of suspicion, even when the initial basis for that suspicion remains undefined. The moment chosen for the opening hook captures this transition perfectly. In that 18-second window, the encounter crosses an invisible legal and psychological line. An officer issues repeated commands for hand placement behind the back. Importantly, this instruction is given before a clear statement of arrest or detention grounds is communicated. From a constitutional perspective, this matters. Ordering a person to place their hands behind their back is not a neutral request, it is a command that implies custody. Custody without explanation creates resistance, not because the subject is criminal, but because the situation is suddenly coercive. The subject reacts with confusion and verbal protest. He does not flee. He does not strike. He questions what is happening. That questioning is immediately reframed by officers as resistance. This is a critical escalation point. In many bodycam encounters, resistance is not an action but a label applied to justify force already being used. Here, the refusal to comply with an unexplained command becomes retroactively defined as obstruction. Once that label is applied, the trajectory of the encounter narrows. Officers no longer seek compliance through communication, they seek control through force. Physical contact begins. Commands continue, but they are now layered over restraint efforts. This creates a feedback loop. The more force is used, the more chaotic the subject's movements become, and the more those movements are cited as justification for further force. It is essential to pause on the legal mechanics at play. At this stage, the officers must satisfy at least reasonable suspicion to detain and probable cause to arrest. The transcript reveals repeated references to resistance, but resistance to what, exactly? If the initial detention lacks clear legal grounding, then resistance to that detention cannot retroactively create lawful grounds. Yet operationally, this is exactly what happens. As the struggle continues, officers announce an arrest while simultaneously citing resistance as the reason for that arrest. This sequencing is not accidental. It is procedural self-reinforcement. The arrest is justified by resistance, and the resistance is defined by non-compliance with arrest commands. The original basis, whether the subject was fighting, whether he posed an ongoing threat, becomes secondary and eventually irrelevant. The environment compounds the problem. Bystanders are present. Voices overlap. Officers feel observed and, potentially, judged. This external pressure often accelerates enforcement behavior. The need to assert control becomes performative. Commands grow louder. Threats of force, including chemical agents, are introduced verbally before any attempt at de-escalation. The message is clear. Compliance is demanded immediately, not negotiated. From the subject's perspective, the experience is disorienting. He is physically handled without a clear explanation, told he is being arrested without being told why, and threatened with escalating force for questioning the process. His verbal responses shift from confusion to anger. This shift is predictable. When procedural justice is absent, when people are not told what is happening or why, they perceive the encounter as illegitimate. That perception fuels resistance, even when resistance worsens outcomes. As officers continue to restrain him, the language used becomes increasingly categorical. He is repeatedly described as resisting, even as he is already under physical control. This language serves an internal function. It reassures officers that their actions are justified. It also creates a narrative record that will later be relied upon in reports. Bodycam footage often reveals this phenomenon. Officers narrate resistance in real time to establish legal cover. The escalation does not plateau, it intensifies. The subject is moved, repositioned, restrained further. Each movement is accompanied by commands that assume non-compliance. At no point is there a reset, a moment where an officer steps back to explain the reason for detention or arrest. That absence is telling. Explanation would slow the encounter and reintroduce legal scrutiny. Control is faster. As time passes, the subject's behavior deteriorates. He becomes verbally aggressive, emotionally volatile, and increasingly incoherent. This is not evidence of initial criminality, it is evidence of stress under coercion. Prolonged restraint, confusion, and perceived injustice often trigger this kind of response. Importantly, the system does not distinguish between cause and effect. The subject's later behavior is used to validate earlier decisions. The mention of medical distress, difficulty breathing emerges later, but its roots are visible early. The physical struggle, the pressure of restraint, and the psychological panic combine. Officers acknowledge these statements intermittently, but do not treat them as an immediate reason to alter tactics. Instead, compliance remains the primary objective. This reflects a broader institutional pattern. Medical concerns are secondary until they become undeniable. Throughout this first phase, officer-to-officer communication reinforces a unified front. Commands are echoed. Decisions are not questioned. There is no visible internal dissent or supervisory intervention. This is another systemic issue. Group dynamics in policing often suppress individual caution. Once a path is chosen, deviation feels like betrayal. The subject's repeated demands for explanation are met with procedural responses rather than substantive ones. He is told he is under arrest. He is told to comply. He is told resistance will result in consequences. What he is not told is why this is happening in the first place. That omission is not accidental, it reflects a culture where authority is presumed, not justified. By the end of Part 1, the encounter has fully transitioned from a response to a reported disturbance into a prolonged custodial struggle. The original alleged offenser fight has faded into the background. The new offense is resistance, born entirely from the enforcement process itself. This is the central tragedy of the case. A situation that may have ended with separation and release instead spirals into arrest, force, and lasting consequences. What makes this incident particularly instructive is not the presence of chaos, but the absence of restraint. At multiple points, officers could have slowed the encounter, clarified commands, or disengaged momentarily to reassess. Instead, each decision compounds the next. Authority becomes brittle. Control becomes the goal rather than safety or justice. Part 1 closes with the power dynamic firmly tilted. The subject is restrained, the narrative of resistance is established, and the officer's actions are now locked into a trajectory that will be difficult to unwind. The system has chosen its story, and everything that follows will be filtered through it. By the time Part 2 begins, the encounter has already crossed from enforcement into entrenchment. The physical struggle has ended, but the conflict has not. In many bodycam incidents, this is the moment where tension either dissipates or metastasizes. Here, it metastasizes. Control has been achieved, yet authority remains unstable. The subject is restrained, but the officers are no longer managing a scene, they are managing a narrative. The transition from street-level restraint to transport and custody is where procedural discipline matters most. This is where officers are expected to shift from force to supervision, from command to care. Instead, the tone of the encounter remains adversarial. Commands continue. Corrections continue. The language used toward the subject signals that compliance alone is no longer sufficient. He is expected not just to obey, but to submit emotionally. This phase reveals a critical institutional failure. Once resistance is declared, it becomes permanent. There is no mechanism within the interaction to recognize compliance after the fact. Even when the subject is no longer physically resisting, he is still treated as if resistance is ongoing. This perpetual framing justifies continued restraint, continued pressure, and continued dismissal of complaints. The subject's verbal output becomes increasingly erratic. He oscillates between anger, fear, bravado, and desperation. Importantly, these shifts are not spontaneous. They follow extended restraint, confusion, and perceived injustice. The human nervous system under stress seeks release. When physical movement is restricted, that release becomes verbal. Officers interpret this as further non-compliance, but it is better understood as a stress response. At several points, the subject expresses difficulty breathing. This is not a single utterance but a recurring theme. In modern law enforcement, such statements should trigger immediate reassessment. Positional asphyxia, panic-induced respiratory distress, and medical emergencies are well-documented risks during restraint. Yet the response here is inconsistent. Officers acknowledge the statements verbally, while maintaining the same physical and procedural posture. The contradiction is stark. Concern is expressed, but behavior does not change. This reflects a deeper issue within custodial encounters: the prioritization of order over well-being. Officers are trained to maintain control above all else, often with the implicit belief that loss of control is more dangerous than physical distress. In this framework, medical complaints are filtered through suspicion. Are they real, or are they manipulative? That question delays action, and delay can be fatal. As the subject is moved into the vehicle, the encounter becomes more claustrophobic. The environment constricts. Visibility narrows. Sound echoes. This intensifies stress for everyone involved. For the subject, it compounds panic. For officers, it reinforces the need to finalize the process quickly. The vehicle becomes a container not just for a person, but for unresolved tension. The language used by officers during this phase reveals fatigue and frustration. Commands are shorter. Explanations are perfunctory. The focus shifts to logistics: transport, paperwork, charge selection. This bureaucratic pivot is revealing. Once the arrest is formalized, the human element recedes. The subject becomes an object to be processed. Yet the subject does not psychologically submit. He continues to demand explanation, to assert identity, to challenge legitimacy. This resistance is no longer physical, but it is perceived as equally threatening. Verbal defiance undermines authority in a system that relies heavily on compliance cues. As a result, officers respond with firmness rather than empathy. This is where escalation becomes self-sustaining. The subject's words provoke officers' tone provokes the subject, and the cycle continues. Neither side is de-escalating because the structure of the encounter does not reward de-escalation. There is no benefit, in the moment, for slowing down. The mention of charges becomes more explicit. The original alleged offense remains ambiguous, but resistance is now central. This is significant. Resistance charges often function as enforcement multipliers. They transform ambiguous encounters into prosecutable cases. From an institutional perspective, they validate officer action. From the subject's perspective, they confirm suspicion that the process is unjust. As the subject continues to speak, his language crosses into threats and extreme statements. This is the point where public sympathy often evaporates. But analytically, it is crucial to distinguish cause from effect. These statements emerge after prolonged restraint, emotional overload, and perceived powerlessness. They are not evidence of initial danger, they are evidence of psychological breakdown. Officers respond to these statements with dismissal rather than containment. There is no attempt to disengage verbally or redirect the interaction. Instead, the focus remains on compliance and control. This choice has consequences. Verbal escalation increases stress, which exacerbates physical symptoms, which then complicate custody. At multiple moments, officers indicate that medical attention may be necessary. This acknowledgement exists in tension with continued enforcement. The subject is told help is coming, yet he remains restrained and distressed. This limbo state is particularly dangerous. It communicates care without delivering it, which erodes trust further. The subject's identity becomes a recurring theme. He asserts who he is, where he is from, and what he believes his status to be. In custodial psychology, identity assertion is a common response to dehumanization. When a person feels reduced to a case number or charge, they cling to self-definition. Officers, trained to neutralize variables, often interpret this as ego or defiance. The interaction reveals how quickly an encounter can become untethered from its original purpose. Whatever happened at the beginning, the alleged fight no longer matters operationally. The system is now responding to the subject's reaction to the system. This recursive dynamic is one of the most troubling aspects of modern enforcement encounters. Throughout Part 2, there is a notable absence of supervisory intervention. No one appears to step in to reset tone or strategy. This absence is not unusual. Bodycam footage frequently shows frontline officers operating autonomously even during prolonged incidents. Without oversight, early mistakes calcify into policy-consistent outcomes. The subject's continued complaints about breathing intensify. Whether rooted in panic, physical restraint, or both, they signal genuine distress. Officers eventually adjust positioning, but the delay matters. In high-stress encounters, seconds can determine outcomes. The system's reluctance to prioritize medical assessment reflects an institutional blind spot. As transport continues, the subject oscillates between resignation and defiance. He acknowledges the inevitability of charges while simultaneously rejecting their legitimacy. This cognitive dissonance is a hallmark of perceived injustice. He is not negotiating release, he is protesting process. Officers, by contrast, have shifted fully into procedural mode. The language of care is replaced by the language of completion. Get him inside. Secure the restraints. Move forward. The encounter is now about finishing the task rather than resolving the conflict. Part 2 ends with the situation stabilized but unresolved. The subject is in custody, yet emotionally volatile. Officers have maintained control, but at the cost of legitimacy. The narrative of resistance is intact, but the original justification remains murky. What began as a response to a disturbance has become a prolonged demonstration of how authority, once challenged, can harden rather than adapt. The stage is now set for the final phase. In Part 3, the consequences of these decisions, legal, psychological, and institutional, come into full view. The system will close ranks, charges will be finalized, and the deeper implications of this encounter will become impossible to ignore. By the time Part 3 begins, the encounter has lost any remaining connection to its original justification. What remains is the institutional aftermath of escalation. Charges crystallize, narratives hardened, and accountability diluted by procedure. This final phase is not defined by action, but by consequence. It is where decisions made under pressure are no longer reversible, only explainable. The subject is now fully embedded within the custodial system. The environment has changed, but the dynamic has not. He is restrained, contained, and subject to continuous supervision. Yet the emotional volatility persists. This is not incidental. Prolonged high adrenaline encounters do not end when restraints are applied. The body remains in fight-or-flight mode long after physical control is established. The system, however, treats restraint as resolution. The subject's verbal behavior continues to deteriorate. Statements escalate in intensity and severity. At this stage, officers interpret his words not as distress but as confirmation of character. This is a crucial psychological pivot. Once a subject is framed as inherently dangerous or unstable, everything they say reinforces that frame. There is no longer an incentive to contextualize or to escalate. This framing has legal implications. The subject's statements, made under extreme stress and restraint, become part of the evidentiary record. They are not evaluated for credibility or causation, they are catalogued. The system does not ask whether these statements were provoked, whether they emerged from panic, or whether they reflect a genuine threat. They are simply recorded as behavior. At the same time, officers begin to articulate the charges more clearly. The final charge list is revealing. The primary offense is not the alleged fight that prompted the response, but resisting an officer without violence. This outcome is emblematic of a broader enforcement pattern. When initial suspicion is weak or ambiguous, resistance charges fill the gap. They transform uncertainty into certainty. This transformation is not neutral. Resistance charges are uniquely powerful because they are self-referential. The officer's perception of resistance becomes the basis for the charge. There is rarely independent corroboration beyond the officer's account and the bodycam footage, which itself is shaped by camera angle, audio distortion, and situational chaos. The system treats this as sufficient. From the subject's perspective, this confirms his deepest fear, that the process was never about what he did, but about how he responded to being controlled. His repeated assertions that he did nothing wrong are not addressed substantively. Instead, they are met with procedural finality. The charges are set. The process moves forward. Medical considerations resurface intermittently. The subject continues to express distress. Officers acknowledge these statements while maintaining custody. Eventually, medical evaluation is referenced, but it occurs within the enforcement framework rather than outside it. This distinction matters. Medical care is not initiated because of concern, it is permitted because custody requires it. This approach reflects a systemic tension between care and control. Law enforcement agencies are not medical institutions, yet they routinely manage people in medical distress. Training emphasizes recognition of emergencies, but operational culture often delays response until symptoms become undeniable. In this case, the subject's distress is visible long before it is prioritized. The subject's sense of identity and grievance intensifies. He speaks about his life, his past, his future. These monologues are not random. They are attempts to reassert humanity within a system that has reduced him to a charge. Officers, focused on task completion, do not engage with these statements beyond maintaining order. The disconnect widens. As the encounter nears its conclusion, the institutional machinery becomes fully visible. Names are requested. Identification is sought. The administrative process takes precedence. The subject resists providing information, not out of strategy, but out of distrust. He no longer believes that cooperation will yield fairness. This belief is not irrational, it is shaped by the preceding hours. Officers respond to this non-cooperation with patience on the surface and pressure underneath. They explain the consequences of delay. They emphasize efficiency. The underlying message is clear: compliance is inevitable, and resistance only prolongs discomfort. This is not negotiation, it is procedural coercion. The power imbalance is absolute. The subject has no leverage, no audience, and no immediate recourse. His earlier visibility, surrounded by bystanders, has given way to isolation. This shift often changes officer behavior. Without public scrutiny, interactions become more transactional. The goal is no longer to be seen as reasonable, but to finish the job. What is striking is how normalized this trajectory is. Nothing about the encounter triggers an internal pause or external intervention. Each step follows established patterns. Officers act within policy. Charges align with common practice. The system absorbs the incident without friction. This normalization is the most unsettling aspect of the case. From an analytical perspective, the encounter illustrates how small procedural choices accumulate. The initial failure to clearly identify the subject's role in the disturbance sets the stage. The early use of ambiguous commands creates confusion. The rapid escalation to physical restraint forecloses communication. The labeling of resistance justifies force. Each step narrows the range of possible outcomes. By the end, the subject's extreme statements overshadow the initial context. Viewers are tempted to judge him solely by his worst moments. This is a cognitive trap. Those moments did not arise in a vacuum. They were produced by a system that prioritizes control over clarity, speed over explanation, and authority over legitimacy. The officers, for their part, are not portrayed as villains within the system. They follow training. They rely on familiar scripts. They respond to perceived threats. Yet this is precisely the problem. When harmful outcomes arise from routine behavior, accountability becomes diffuse. No single decision appears egregious in isolation, but the cumulative effect is profound. The final disposition of the case underscores this reality. The charge reflects resistance, not violence. The original alleged fight fades into irrelevance. The system resolves the incident by validating its own authority. Whether justice was served becomes a secondary question. This encounter exemplifies a recurring pattern in bodycam footage across jurisdictions. Disturbance calls escalate into custodial confrontations. Confusion becomes resistance. Resistance becomes justification. The system closes ranks. The individual bears the consequences. In the aftermath, the official record will be clean. Officers responded to a call. They issued commands. The subject failed to comply. Force was used. Charges were filed. Medical attention was considered. Policy was followed. On paper, the incident resolves neatly. But bodycam footage tells a different story. It reveals the gaps between policy and practice, between authority and legitimacy, between control and care. It shows how easily encounters slip into escalation when communication falters and patience wears thin. Part 3 closes not with resolution, but with recognition. Recognition that this incident is not an anomaly, but a case study. Recognition that accountability requires more than policy compliance, it requires structural change. And recognition that without such change, similar encounters will continue to unfold, quietly, routinely, and with devastating consequences for those caught inside them. The camera eventually stops recording. The system moves on. The subject remains with the weight of the encounter, its charges, and its consequences. What began as a moment of chaos ends as a lesson in how power, once asserted without clarity, rarely relinquishes control.